Thank you. So I'm always thinking that when I do presentations like this, that some of the things I show people are new, and some of the concepts that I introduce are maybe a bit sort of evolutionary, maybe. I always like it when people are it has an impression, so I'm hoping that it will. Body, Space and the Virtual, a Narrative of Becoming is the title that I came up with. And while I've been working on this presentation, I found this quote from Mackenzie Wark, who wrote the Hacker Manifesto a number of years ago. And he said that abstraction is always an abstraction of nature, a process that creates nature's double, a second nature, a space of human existence in which collective life dwells among its own products and comes to take the environment it produces to be natural. And I'm not sure if I completely agree with this, but I've been thinking about this quote the whole time that I've been working on this presentation, and this concept of the natural, and whether we're moving into a new nature for ourselves, and that we share together, and perhaps it will even flow on further into the nature that exists outside culture. But I'm not sure about that. That's a big question. It's something that motivates me a lot when I think about these ideas, some of which I'm going to present to you today. So this is a picture from a live augmented reality flash mob that took place in Amsterdam a few months ago, where people were invited to come to the Dam Square in central Amsterdam, and where if you held up your media device with a screen, your smartphone or something, you saw the image of the Beatles walking through the Dam Square. But when you moved the phone, they were gone. It was done with QR codes and with an app that you downloaded onto your phone. So virtual space is becoming less virtual every day because we live in it. From the online and shared spaces of massive multiplayer games to GPS or GIS, Global Positioning System, Global Information System, and the augmented and network technologies of iPhones and wireless connectivity. The peoples of affluent economies realize virtual spaces every day. What do these spaces mean for our understanding of the body? How can we imagine the body with its associated territories of gender, sexuality, and cognitive awareness in this time of virtual space? This presentation examines these questions in conjunction with selected examples and proposes a conceptualization of the body based on the virtual as a narrative of becoming, which I'll explain this idea. Many of the ideas and analytical concepts expressed in this paper come from my doctoral dissertation, which will be publicly defended on the 5th of November 2013 in this room. You're all invited. What is virtual space? I am thinking a lot about this, and I've come to the conclusion that virtual space is codified space. And that doesn't rely necessarily on digital technology. If anyone has seen the film or read the book Perfume by Patrick, Perfume it creates a virtual space, I think. I think there's a lot you can argue for, that perfume, it is a technology in a sense, but it's a meaningful system that is shared with people in space. How I elaborate on this concept of virtual space being codified space in relation to bodies, expressions of identity in relation to contemporary discourse and expressions of identity is related to contemporary discourse. And I've tried to pull up examples now that are happening now, things that are being talked about, discussed, written about. So just to begin with, what are the codes of virtual space in relation to the body? The first idea is that genres of space create places. And I have an example. Having moved to Sweden at the turn of the century, and I moved into a flat in Oldhem, a flat that was built in about 1970, I quickly found that the kitchen was made for one person to cook. It's very difficult for 2 or 3 people to make food at the same time in that kitchen. And I thought about that spatial configuration and what that meant for the sort of people that may have lived there when it was built, or the ideas, about roles of work in the family and things like that. So I included a 1950s kitchen that was featured with an enamel company called Chemglow. Genres of space. Social and historical markers define spaces according to how they signify genre formation. These can be, in terms of space, it can be wealthy neighbourhood, domestic space, Gender and space, masculine, feminine. These spaces can be gendered. References to genre within the virtual spaces can result in the creation of places. A place is something that you identify within a space. It has boundary. It can have a name. It can have a history. It can have certain attributes that dictate behaviour, interactions, these sorts of things. Eva Kingstedt, who is an academic in Stockholm at the moment, in 2006 she critiques place in this way in relation to the historical genre of Naziness, how Nazi soldiers, Nazi people are portrayed in Return to Castle Wolfenstein, a classic first-person shooter game, and Medal of Honor Underground. In Kingstedt's approach, the representation of place within digitally mediated narratives is dependent upon locations identified through a number of visual signs that, together with connotations to other mediated visual representations, such as film and photography, establish a feeling of being in a certain place. In the case of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, you are in a Nazi castle in the mountains of Austria, fighting your way through this labyrinth against Nazis. The establishment of place, according to Kingstedt, is dependent on the pre-existing narrative associations, which are a part of connotations, quote, connotations to other mediated visual representations. In this sense, places in narrative are referential and not simply points within the works where features are located. And these are overall spatial and part of design. The fact that I'm 3/4 into the game, or I'm playing on the 3rd level, that is the design of the game. It doesn't work. Place doesn't work in the same way. There is a place within the game space, but then I'm talking more about a representational sense of place. That I am in Chicago. I am in World War II Berlin or something. The second of these codes for virtual space in relation to the body is perspective. The alignment of vision and position in relation to spatial configuration, that's perspective by definition. The most famous example of perspective as code is Quattrocento, Alberti's Della Pittura on painting. It was written between 1435 and 1436. Elements that define Quattrocento include the central vanishing point, where, quote, all other edges are parallel to the surface of the canvas. So those surfaces that are not parallel to the surface of the canvas lead to the central vanishing point. And if you look at Renaissance painting, you see that consistently. That's from a book called The Rise of Renaissance Perspective. Precise spatial depth with variations in focus, that is something else that you see in this Quattrocento. Symmetrical balancing, focusing upon a point of view, and attention to scale between figures and buildings, natural settings, figures, this sort of thing, which includes the viewing subject. The viewing subject, scale is related to the viewing subject, so objects in the distance appear smaller, objects in the foreground appear larger, this sort of thing. Quattrocento practices bricolage also, which, as it was architectural as well, it wasn't just painting, it was sculpture, architecture, city design. These things came through in this perspective system. And Quattrocento practiced bricolage, the taking and arranging and remixing of certain elements, particularly from classical sources, and you'll see porticos and things like this, creating a sense of time and space centred upon an individual experiencing it. So this sort of grandiose architecture reminiscent of ancient Rome was created from the perspective of a viewing subject also. So in contrast, or in comparison to these ideas, virtual spaces, perspective is panoramic. You're moving through a virtual space yourself. It's not fixed from a central viewing point and arranged around a mobile viewing subject. Virtual space can defy Cartesian ratios, breadth, height, depth, and can be defined by sound. I'll show you examples of this also. And can be defined by sound and the multimedia invocation of genres, like remediation. I'm listening to the radio while I'm driving my car in LA Noir, and I'm listening to Billie Holiday on the radio on my car, my 1949 Plymouth or something. There's a whole range of genres evoked in that series of remediations, and you're experiencing it as the avatar, as the figure, as a detective trying to find criminals. As infinite depth of focus is common to virtual space also. Even in augmented spaces, when you're moving through a wireless environment or something like that, you still experience infinite depth of focus. if you're watching, I watch people all the time in Stockholm on the bus, nobody looks out the window anymore. Everyone's looking at their screen and they're experiencing a perpetual infinite depth of focus with that visual arrangement that they're experiencing it. Meanwhile, I'm looking out the window. I'm always ready for something to happen, something unexpected. Scale is relative in virtual space. Scale is relative to how the experiencing subject is embodied in the virtual space. So you can be embodied as an avatar. You can be embodied as a viewer of a screen in relation to a website or a flash animation or something like that. And this viewing experience qualifies the perspective and the scale, also the scale. And that goes for wireless mediation also. When you're moving through spaces and you've got your handheld device also, the scale will be experienced in relation to them. This is perspective. Then audio, which I'm very interested in and is making a huge comeback. Audio architecture, attention to audio in audio-visual experiences is in the last 10 years has become a much stronger element in delivering this sort of mediation to people, which I'm happy about. Audio is inherently spatial, as you know from your hearing experience, how it orientates you to spaces. Audio can suggest the qualities of space as a boundary. And in my analysis, in my doctoral thesis, I see space as the outlying layer of these texts. When you're reading an interactive text, the outermost layer of that text is the sound envelope that encases you, the computer, the story, the characters, everything. You're all held together within this. Same as Dolby sound systems in cinemas. The sound experience, that attention in these cinema environments too, works on the same principle. But you're inside a building too, and you're in a very ordered fashion in the cinema. You can't move freely. There's lots of rules about cinema viewing. Okay. My next method of coding space in relation to the body is monumentality. These are mobile telephone towers somewhere. I'm not sure where. But monumentality comes from Henri Lefebvre, the author of Production of Space, who I am a great fan of. Monumentality is an emphasis on key defining points within an interdependent system. The points define the totality of the space. Monumentality is identifiable in digital media according to how it particularly emphasizes features. The emphasized features signify the strong points, nexus, or anchors within a space. I read these features as significant in how they contribute to a space as representational in narrative. But they're repeated and they form sort of the strong points of that spatial fabric that you're experiencing. It can be, in a website, it can be a link button that is repeated so you know where the link button is. That's a very simple example. In a 3D combat game, it can be the system of trenches and the sort of the points along that way that you identify as significant within the structure of the overall game. In the work of Lefebvre, focusing as it does on architecture and urban space, the monumental takes on the role of a social signifier. And in doing so, it articulates prohibitions in the sense of a socially produced and therefore meaningful interconnected arrangement that results in shared space. If you look how a city is, church bells were a very significant part of a city landscape. And this moved up to the level of parishes and congregations and where you belonged to and what your church was and all this other stuff, right to the point of where you were buried. This was all within this structure that arranged space according to rules. And ultimately identity also, I would say. Lefebvre describes the monumentality of palaces, temple, stadium, or agora, and what these mean to the inhabitants in the occupation and use of a space. The inhabitants of the space share meanings in the monumental, and this involves what Lefebvre terms a recognition effect. This recognition is the reception of a generally accepted power and a generally accepted wisdom. In this way, the interactivity organised according to monumentality is based on the recognition of spatially structured and therefore hierarchical social and cultural representation. And my final coding point is GIS, Global Information System, or GPS, Global Positioning System. It works on a principle of triangulation where you're positioned in relation to two other sources, towers or signal points, and then they can triangulate your position. This works on mobile phones. Plus there is, specific devices you can buy for your car to get directions, many different things. And it's a grid system, it's locative media, and it sets the body within a feedback system. You're part of a feedback system within the GIS. The body is the centre of the space as it pinpoints its location in relation to the space around it. In this sense, GIS tells you where you are, not where you are going. And somebody, I think, raised this point yesterday, that there seems to be this eternal present in this mediation. You know you are going somewhere, but the voice on the travel guide is telling you where you are and what your next move is. So you're continually in this movement. Maybe when you get there, then you're told, oh, you have arrived or something. It mediates the perpetually mobile as it is progressing towards an endless onwardness. You could theoretically be always in this moment with this GIS guide in this car somewhere driving onward and onward and onward. It's not like a narrative in that sense that it has a beginning, a middle and an end. By the same logic, the genres, perspective, audio, monumentality and GIS create a sense of space mediated by the digital. Architecture also results in virtual space and how it mediates the experience of the body in three-dimensional scale. So, in a sense, architecture is virtual space also. We create it and we use it for certain. We have a meaning system around us now, complete with art and things like that. An ordered environment with a goal in mind. And I could go on further about these ideas about how we... This is what I've come to in my own research, in my dissertation. But I'm also interested in the ideas of sense and gesture, haptics, like simulation of touch, and navigation. And as I mentioned before, perfume is another example of this virtual space. And with this we action, this motion tracking and things like that, people are starting to do research about body in relation to reading, how the body is positioned and reacts and interacts with the reading experience in a virtual space to the point of where it envelops you. You're being tracked. I just put this in because I always like having a painting around, and this is a good one, and it sort of fits. Space is both codified and realised in use, occupation and habitation. In a sense, vision itself is encoded by virtual space and is realised in the recognition of the codes of designated spaces. And Surrealist art was also tweaking these visual sort of codes, I think, some more successful than others. But I think Chirico was doing it very well. And I have a quote from Lefebvre: "The vanishing line, the vanishing point, and the meeting of parallel lines at infinity were the determinants of a representation, at once intellectual and visual, which promoted the primacy of the gaze in a kind of logic of visualization. This representation, which had been in the making for centuries, now became enshrined in architecture and urbanistic practices as the code of linear perspective." And this is a further elaboration, diagrammatical representation of Lefebvre's model of how space is tricky because we create it and we experience it at the same time. So he divided it into three parts. He thought there was the representational space, ideas, imagination, theory and vision. Representational space is the space of inhabitants and users. We experience this space in ideas, in decisions, in movement and navigation, in recognition of chairs and tables, ordered behaviour, things like that result. And then there's representations of space, which conceptualise space of planners, scientists, urbanists, that tends towards a system of verbal sign. It's more organisational, more something. I mean, people do it every day too also. Walking through a city square or something like that, trying to get to the bus, things like that. You plan these movements out, you move through space. And then there's spatial practice, which is revealed through the physical and experiential deciphering of space, which is again this movement and this sort of thing. It's my contention that virtual space operates through the same triad. This can be demonstrated by how bodies relate to technological mediated space that is encoded as virtual. And then I went on to Don Ide, the philosopher, phenomenologist. I'm not sure about pronouncing his last name. 2002 distinguished between the virtual closed system, giving the example of robotics, and open context life world situations. contrast between systems and context, I think, is very important. And for my own analysis, the argument concerning virtual space, I try to pay attention to context. This is not going to be totally enclosed. There is not going to be totally enclosed matrix-style system of virtual reality. It's not going to happen, I don't think. I'm pretty certain. That your awareness can exist in a duration for a lifetime, totally unaware of your body. I think this is sort of a variation on a Cartesian sort of fallacy, this intellect-body separation thing. I don't think it's going to happen. And that's the irony of the Matrix in a way. I mean, in the sense that it was revolutionary in this idea that, and this sort of Baudrillardian hell that we're all living in, but at the same time, they seem to be basing it on the idea that there was this union. However, there is already an open context layer of virtual space which permeates everything we do, see, hear, believe and think, and you cannot escape it. You can only change it. You can't escape this economy, this virtual space that we're living in. And a man who lives in, well, he exploits elements of it. Stellark, the Australian body science artist. Ide says in his Bodies, Virtual Bodies and Technology that neither muscle or mind has reached out into the open world except in human technological symbiotic forms. We can't, so far, we haven't divorced ourselves from this body in order to propel something out into the world that we either don't look at or see or experience in some sensual way. And it has to function in conjunction, in joining with that human. Ide makes an embodied, disembodied variation of perspective based in the phenomenological awareness. He discusses extending the here body as a culturally specific construct with logics that reinforce a set of specific assumptions about the body. By reading contemporary renditions of these extensions of the here body, it becomes possible to see or understand something of these constructed logics. The human technological symbiotic forms are prosthetic, material, or operate from a cognitive sense. Space is occupied and created by the negotiation and interpretation of these objects. Ide ends his short phenomenological explanation of the virtual body with questions concerning our desires and fantasies which get projected into our technologies. The direction of desire opened by embodied technologies also has its positive and negative thrusts. Instrumentation in the knowledge activities, notably science, is the gradual extension of perception into new realms. You can see the very, very, very small, or, I mean, as I'm going to refer to shortly, the DNA helix and this sorts of things, these beautiful visualizations of these protein sequences that I'm pretty certain do not resemble this in the body. I haven't actually looked into it. But in any case, it's a visualization of something that is so infinitely tiny we don't register it. But technology has given us that ability to extend our senses through visualization and representation into that realm that we then turn into a code we work with, change, evolve, develop. Instrumentation in the knowledge of activity, the desire to see, but seeing is seeing through instrumentation. Negatively, the desire for pure transparency is the wish to escape the limitations of the material technology. I'm quoting Don Edie here, by the way. I should point that out. It sounded good. I'm now quoting me. For the hacker who lives by code, a quote from Mackenzie Welk, there may be no return, I began with this, there may be no return to nature, but as third nature extends itself in time and space, it becomes the medium of expression of the production of the fourth nature, a fifth nature to infinity, natures which may overcome the destructive limits of the second nature produced by class society. I'm not sure about this, but it's something to consider, and maybe it's a struggle that we're experiencing now. I wrote a long blog post on my blog recently about the war we live in and the way that people are being dealt with who step outside these accepted structures of information technology. People who are exploiting loopholes, sharing information, stealing things, and the incredibly heavy treatment that they're getting. And I wonder about this. It's not random, and it's not some cataclysmic fascistic thing either. I think it's part of something, a larger economy. There are reasonings behind it because of what we're moving through at the moment. Things are being assigned value. that are becoming very valuable. Why are they becoming valuable? Because of other things that are happening. Much more complex networks are being developed. But I'm not sure if we're going to escape class society. That remains to be seen. But I think there's definitely a struggle going on around that. With the production of virtual space, we are in dialogue with the images of nature we have inherited in our history, culture, language and art, even in our scientific methods. And my final theoretical slant on this, to return to the burden of the enlightened self, in the Lacanian reading of virtual space, Slavoj Žižek describes the user identity psyche in virtual space. He says, I quote, "I can follow the escapist logic and simply act out my real-life difficulties in virtual reality, or I can use virtual reality to become aware of the inconsistencies and multiplicities of the components of my subjective identifications and work them through. In this second case, the interface screen functions in a way of homologenous to the psychoanalysis. The suspension of the symbolic rules which regulate my real-life activity enables me to stage externalize my repressed content, which I am otherwise unable to confront." And I've seen many examples of this. There are many people, I've seen examples of people living their lives through avatars who are agoraphobic, who are social phobias, who cannot communicate with people. Students who work through avatars become incredibly more confident than they were in the classroom. Things like that. This mask culture is interesting. The drama and the mask is something else that's related to this. And people have also written about puppetry and virtual embodiment. These are all things that they're so new. They're things that we have to explore further and ask questions about and build up a vocabulary for, a terminology. This is the film Existence by David Cronenberg, where an alternate reality game, you plug into this organic thing and you enter another world where you're playing a game. And as the film progresses, you are uncertain of which world you're in as a viewer. I think based on these same sort of ideas and fears and things that I've been describing through the work of other people. This is a game called Child of Eden. It's by the same Japanese designer who did Rez. It's another game, I think it's a PlayStation game. But concepts of Cartesian space are completely abandoned in this game. It's more like surfing in an ocean of light, the game itself. As far as like where your body is in relation to objects and things like that. And also how you play the game, you also compose music as you're moving through the game. And the better you get at the game, the better the music gets. It gets nicer and nicer. Here language, in returning to Zizek's quote, language could easily replace the spaces of the virtual, where the suspension of symbolic rules becomes the suspension of disbelief of Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the Biographia Literaria published in 1817, and which is a continual returning point for narrative studies, this idea of the suspension of disbelief in this storytelling activity. Belief in this case is actually the perspective and interaction created by the need for new codes to understand, manage and inhabit virtual space. So we have to evolve new codes, we return to the older codes, we build hybrids and things like that in order to negotiate this representation that's been given to us by these digital tools. A survey of the literature related to understanding virtual space results in many texts on the notion of virtual reality, the believable unreal, the immersive simulation that replaces and reorganizes our ideas and beliefs about physical space, architecture and perception. But the virtual in the past decade has become more pervasive, more finely grained and more integrated into daily life. It's not Lawnmower Man. It's not you put a helmet on and you disappear, or you become somebody else or something like that. It's much more subtle. And it had been going on earlier, but now the feedback system is so rapid and the technology presents such engaging images that it has become more powerful. It's actually a medium of communication now that can be accessed by millions of people. The virtual space is space that is codified using digital technology. Language can be called virtual, though it does not create spaces in the same way as software can. Space can be augmented or overlaid by strata of information. Even when VR, virtual reality, was at its most anticipated heights, there was still a body experiencing it. There was still a components of organic whole present in the codified and mediated experience of the space. In other words, the matrix as delivered to us by the Wachowskis in a myth based on the fallacy of Cartesian dualism. It's not going to happen. Today we are living virtual lives, coded systems of meaning that expand out through our awareness from our bodies via keyboards, screens, motion sensing technology, wireless signaling devices, handheld devices, and soon to be wearables. And this is the most famous wearable around at the moment. Body code united in vision. And I'm both anticipating and I'm nervous about it. I'm wondering how it's going to happen. I wish they would just release it and everyone would get one and we'd start the process and see what happens. But it's being done in such an agonizing, marketing, sort of gradual increment torture way. But it will happen. There is a researcher here at the university who's going to be given one in the education department soon. And she's going to blog about it, what it's like. In this instance and in others that I've talked about, you can see where the body is made virtual by code. I mean, you're extending vision. There's already people producing comedy videos of someone sitting at dinner and with the stranger trying to find information about the person so they can answer intelligently or suggest topics that will get this person into bed with them and stuff like that. Or the malfunctioning software trying to get it to work and things like that. This body is made virtual by code. The virtual as narrative of becoming is defined by code. So there is this eventuality, this process going on. There are things happening. This code is driving this sort of tangent through the experience. The body can be augmented through the intervention of code with this visual interface moving. The intervention of code can result in augmentation. You've got access to the internet, probably servers, whether you're going to pay a subscription in order to upload and download material and things like that while you're interacting with the space around you. And I also thought about this idea of the intervention of code can result in termination, that there can be this cut-off point too, where you lose these abilities, where you become this person with this vision, but then at some point maybe you lose it. In Swedish, there's the expression is always the computer hängde sig, yeah? It hangs itself. It's a really violent metaphor, but the computer dies, and then I am outside the computer. We are no longer joined. Augmentation of the body is an actualization. This is a quote from Edie again. I keep using him without saying. The augmentation of the body is an actualization of the existential contradictions concerning technology. These contradictions are embodied in the mind-body of action in response to code. So you're getting this union of the intellect and the body through this code experience. And the cyborg, I think you could carry it over into. Okay, that's enough of the theory. Now I'm going to show you examples, and it's historical. So we start with, this is a jacquard loom that was produced in 1801, and it's amazing. It was first demonstrated in 1801. The jacquard loom codified labour in a post-human register, punch cards fed into the reading machine, replacing physical actions by people. So weaving could be done by this machine based on these cards. And when Babbage did his engine later, he looked back on this idea as the motivation for the design. And then I'll just show you, this is a silk image in silk from 1839 that was produced with 24,000 punch cards. Very fine detail. Labour was thus reduced to a digital process, from card to machine to patent to commodity. And people were upset about this too. There was a protest about it. Now, this is another sort of transpiration process. These are avatars. And Sandra Danilovic, from a book that's about to be published, which I'm involved with, her essay is called Virtual Lens to Exposure, Aesthetics, Theory and the Ethics of Documentary Filmmaking in Second Life, from Understanding Machinima, Essays on Filmmaking in Virtual Worlds, edited by Jenna Ung. The aesthetics of virtual reality can also be striking due to the quirks of the gaming engine. Second Life offers phantasmagorical, Second Life being a virtual world, phantasmagorical and whimsical geographies that can inspire a filmmaker with their bold and scintillating colours, graphics and textures, embodied in the primitivism of the movements and skins of the avatar. Second Life can thus be an inexplicable world where the humorous and the poetic tragicomically mix in the stilted and pre-programmed basic expressions of the avatar, where its crudely animated forms may reach a transcendent beauty when given weight in a narrative. Some viewers may find the Second Life or other VR environments are the antithesis of aesthetic expression, Yet others may discover that these worlds are strangely beautiful and poetically resonant. In its telling that Lev Manovich, 2001, comments on communication in virtual reality as one language or any other symbol, without language or any other symbols, locked in virtual reality caves, with language taken away, we will communicate through gestures, body movements and grimaces like our primitive ancestors. I'm not sure about that. But an avatar can blow a kiss, performs Tai Chi in a ball gown, or makes love. And the recording of these actions can provide an aesthetic and poetic experience for the viewer. So the general thrust of this essay and the whole book is that when we're watching machinima, films made in these virtual worlds, we're watching a report back from a world. We're watching the documentation of a reality, or the creative use of that space to make stories, fiction in a sense. And this is a series of images of people and their avatars. And if we follow some of the ideas that I've mentioned already about the sort of projection or this interaction or the body being in this space, many people believe they are their avatar, including myself. And these are some avatars. Now, most of them, there is a symmetry between the actual body and the avatar. And apparently, studies have found that most people try to represent their avatars as closely to them as, or maybe an idealized version of themselves. The more serious the user, the closer they are to the body of the user. But in an idealized, stylized sort of sense. This is amazing, they have the same dress. And then this is different. And finally, this I find a touching image. And you can't help but think about the motivations and then why these choices are made and what they mean. Are they meaningful in any way? The virtual flesh as an aesthetic consideration is no longer something we view, it is us. This is me again, I'm not quoting anyone here. We are becoming the virtual flesh, and we can now augment our bodies in conjunction with reading its codes, and these codes we have applied to the body, drawn up from the sequences formulated by science. And now this is very recent, following a detection of a faulty gene, BRCA1, film star and role model Angelina Jolie decided recently to have a bilateral mastectomy to avoid significant risk of developing breast cancer. So I think that in itself is astounding. She had, and apparently it's not so strange, it can be done quite easily, that you can have your genetic code read, look for these indicators of future disease, and then take action. And in the case of Angelina, she took very dramatic action and had both her breasts removed and augmented them. Then she had prostheses put in. She wrote on the New York Times, 2 weeks later, I had the major surgery where the breast tissue is removed and temporary fillers are put in. The operation can take 8 hours. You wake up with drain tubes and expanders in your breast. It does feel like a scene out of science fiction film, which is an interesting thing to say, I think. But days after surgery, you can be back to normal life. 9 weeks later, the final surgery is completed with the reconstruction of the breast with an implant. There have been many advances in this procedure in the last few years, and the results can be beautiful. So it's an aesthetic experience as much as it is a medical procedure. And I'm sure it's very much about her identity as well. But it goes back to this code too, the genetic code that they read in her body. And her history, of course. That's what turned them towards looking for the code too. Her mother and her sister both died. And this action reminded me of a film, I don't know if you've seen it, Gattaca. Made in 1997, a science fiction film set in the near future. It's about a world controlled by the Gattaca Corporation, where everyone is categorized according to their DNA. Ethan Hawke stars as Vincent, a man whose genes have been deemed inferior by the powers to be. I think he's in a wheelchair, I'm not sure, can't remember. He dreams of travelling to space but is considered fit only for menial jobs. He manages to take some genetic material from an angry disabled man. That's right, he's in the wheelchair. Jude Law, who is genetically superior but obviously unable to make the journey into space. Uma Thurman is the woman who falls in love with Vincent without knowing who he really is. So by augmentation of the body, we literally adhere to the argument that we construct our objects and our objects construct us, which Sherry Tuckle said in 1995, Life on the Screen, the author of Life on the Screen. But the objects are not restricted to physical augmentation in how they construct us as an identity or set of identities. Here's another hot topic. This is the world's first 3D printed gun, which is also available in Sweden on the Pirate Bay. So anyone with a 3D printer and a nail can make it. And it fires a single 9mm or 22 round. It fires a single bullet. And it's been downloaded, it's being shared at the moment by over 2,000 seeders on the Pirate Bay. Physibles, these are called physibles. P-H-Y-S-I-B-L-E-S. A physible is the digital file a 3D printer uses. Physibles is the plural. Physibles create objects by code. How will physibles change the spaces we live in? And I've been thinking about this, and it almost does. I mean, if we can print our own clothes and we can print our own shelters and we can print objects, I mean, theoretically we could print cars, we could print anything if we find materials that are resilient enough. And these can be distributed as code over internet. Shopping will be different. Objects will circulate as natural. Cost-driven pricing will become less driven, and files can be shared that have the potential to affect physical life, including guns. So the Jacquard loom of 1801 codified labour, just as the physibles of 2010 codify objects, and body augmentation codifies bodies, and virtual worlds codify space. Has anyone experienced Grindr? Grindr is a geosocial networking application and social discovery platform for Android, the iPhone, iPod Touch, iPad and Facebook. Grindr is a geosocial network geared towards gay, bisexual and bi-curious men. The app makes use of the device geolocation, which allows users to locate other men within close proximity. So if you get on a train and there is another man there with Grindr who would like to hook up with you, the device will indicate that. This is accomplished through a user interface that displays a grid of representative pictures of men arranged from nearest to furthest away. Tapping on a picture will display a brief profile of that user, as well as the option to chat, send pictures and share one's location. Blender is the heterosexual version of it. Combines GPS location sensing with social networking framework. In these and many other digital applications that place bodies in space in relation to each other, the presentation of ethnicity is coded into the mediation. While this is a seminar in itself, I could talk a lot about it. It's sufficient to say that the bodies are coded, and as one researcher recently noted in the local context, and this is a quote from Tobias Hübner at the presentation in Stockholm called the No Border Camp 2012, and the article was called Swedish Whiteness and Swedish Racism. The quote is, "The idea of being white constitutes the central core and the master signifier of Swedishness and thus of being Swedish." This is something that could be discussed at length. Lisa Nakamura does research with representations of race, negotiations of ethnicity online, and she has mapped these same imaginings of race as is played out in the spaces of the internet. Finally, has anyone seen the Dark Mirror series from the UK? No. It's a series of so far 6 programs, half hour, of sort of the twilight zone for the digital people, looking at ideas of screens, visuality, gaze, things like that. And there's an episode called 15 Million Merits. In that, the writer Charlie Brooker imagines spaces that seem somehow strangely familiar. And the quote from the Telegraph Review is, "Cocooned inside his drab virtual world and forced to spend his days peddling for credits." I'll show you a picture. That's Bing on that side. Cocooned inside his drab virtual world and forced to spend his days peddling for credits while living his life vicariously through a video game avatar. And until he meets this lady on the other side, who is Downton Abbey's Jessica Brown Findlay, and in this series she's called Abby, which I think is related. He spends his time peddling this bicycle, earning credits, spending these credits on either pornography, which appears on a huge screen that surrounds him in his room, or buying clothes and hats for his avatar, who walks around inside this virtual world talking to other avatars. The space occupied by the physical body of Bling is totally controlled, and throughout the episode he gradually attempts to extend his control over space, over what he sees, whom he communicates with, and how much he needs to work. The medium for this attempt to extending spatial control originates in sound. When Bling heard pretty new female drone, they're called drones, Abby, singing in the toilets, he was moved to spend all of his hard-won credits, 15 million of them, to enter her in a TV talent contest, not so loosely based on the one with the big whooshing X in the title. Abby wins, is exploited, and eventually offers up her body as a sexualized image to the millions of drones who desire her. And these are the images that Bling is getting on the wall of his cubicle when he's sleeping. Alone now, Bling works again and finally offers up his body to the spectacle in a desperate attempt to create change. However, it registers as a performance and therefore not real. And he wins the competition and gets a space to live where he can choose. And this is, I might show this. This isn't actually, someone's put the audio of the speech that he makes in front of the judges of this talent competition, where he has got a piece of glass to his neck and he's talking to the judges. Oh no. And with that, he wins the competition because they are so impressed by his passion. And then he's given a bigger cubicle with a better view, and then he produces a program every day for the same people that he was watching before. He becomes part of that system. So finally, just this idea of the narrative of becoming. Virtual space is dependent on presence to be meaningful. This presence as a determinant of meaning can be related to what Espen Aarseth terms the ergodic. The ergodic comes from the Greek words ergon and hodos, meaning work and path. In ergodic literature, non-trivial effort is required to allow the reader to transverse the text. The ergodic comes with a set of rules, as the ergodic work of art is one that in a material sense, this is a quote, the ergodic work of art is one that in a material sense includes the rules of its own use, a work that has certain requirements built in that automatically distinguishes between successful and unsuccessful users, end quote. Aarseth's translation of ergon as work, from the Greek, emphasizes the physical manipulation of the digital text as, quote, a work of physical construction, from Aarseth. In a more nuanced sense, Thayer's Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, 1896, explains ergon as of that which one undertakes to do, enterprise, undertaking, acts, and that's from Acts 5:3 from the biblical. And as, quote, anything accomplished by hand, art, industry, mind, equivalent to, it's in Greek, and that's from 1 Corinthians, Thayer and Thayer. The reference to mind means ergon is not just physical effort, but can include knowledge, interpretation, recognition and understanding. In short, it accommodates reading. What sort of reading is opened by the ergodic space? It is interpreted according to the contemporary factors at play within its structures. It is primarily reflective, as the work is a form of participation in the construction of virtual space, which makes narrative an event or an experience as much as it is a story. The idea of narrative as telling after the event is extremely problematic here. Rather, narrative is a state, a possibility, and a mode of seeing and experiencing space. Under these conditions, narrative becomes pancultural, escaping the confines of a book and mimetic image to occupy landscapes, cities, architectures, and movement. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. This is my avatar. He's about 9 years old.
Thank you so much, James. It was really interesting. And I think we have room for maybe 2 or 3 questions. And then, if you want to stay for coffee,
yeah, of course.
Perhaps you can ask during the break if you have some more questions. So, Josephine was quick.
Yeah. Just a quick question. Have you seen the television series Perspect? It's a spin-off of
Battlestar Galactica. No.
I just started thinking about it when you talked about the avatar and people living through their avatar and becoming the avatar, because in that series some people actually die and their avatars is all that's left, and they try to get them back into physical space. So.
That's a theme too. Catherine Hales writes about this idea of uploading consciousness, and then there's other people. Now in America, and I think in England also, you can have a QR code set into your gravestone, and then when you go to the gravesite, you scan the image, and then you can watch videos of the person who's deceased. You can read their writings. You can pull their Facebook profile up. You can experience something of that person again. Yeah, that's
I've heard a similar, actually, where you can buy a coffin with sound systems that people can play music for you when they visit your grave.
It's amazing. The new Iron Man film, Iron Man 3, has an avatar theme in it. Yeah. Very strong avatar theme.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Yeah, perfect.
I have a question again. It's a comment just like this one. Have you seen Maturity?
I've heard. Yeah, I know the film, but no, I haven't seen it.
A difference is the avatars are actually they have, everyone has like an alter ego, which is like a robot.
Yeah.
They sit in their homes and they kind of go to their their jobs and everything else, inhabiting this robot. Kind of like a perfected version of themselves.
I really thought, I don't know if many people saw it, but I thought the Swedish series Acta Människor was very good.
Yeah.
I was in Australia and my brother showed it to me. Oh, you speak Swedish, you'll understand this. Where did you find this? I didn't know about it until about 6 months ago. I was really impressed by it. I thought it was a very good program. It's, is it Real People? Is that what it's called in English? Something like that.
I'm wondering about these Google glasses. Google glasses.
Glass, they just call it.
Glasses, yeah. As you said, you're sort of looking forward to it, but you're nervous.
Yeah.
And I was kind of interested in the nervous part.
Yeah.
Because even though you probably have no idea what's going to happen when when you start using them, but what do you think that it will mean for our social lives, for our way of moving and our orientation?
I'm just thinking more about the idea that vision is going to be mediated in real time and recorded. Yeah. And in a classroom situation, people can be recording me, can be recording each other. You can be having a conversation. I mean, of course, there is no indicator that the camera is on, apparently. There's no light flashing or anything like that. And there's a sunglass function you can fit over them too, which doesn't obstruct the lens, so it doesn't actually look like people are wearing Google Glass. So there are clubs that are banning them, pubs that are banning them already. I think it's going to change a lot of things. You're going to see like people's lives recorded. There's already a Swedish company that's made a small camera that takes an image every 30 seconds, forever, and uploads it to a server. So then you just wear it, and 30 seconds, an image is taken all the time and uploaded. And apparently they're advertising it as an aid to memory, that you can remember everything because you'll have images of it, thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. I think Google Glass will be similar. People will start mediating experiences. Yeah? First-person pornography will probably take off as a genre. There will be a lot of people filming each other and filming themselves. And I think there is something. I played that speech at the end because I think I started with like the situationist and the idea of the spectacle and this idea of mediation and the removal that comes with mediation, the removal of the spectator or the removal of the subject from the moment. And I think with digital media we have this incredible tool and opportunity, and we have to be very careful about it and aware of what's going on. People do, because it can't be made by the market or the government. It's a collective experience. And I don't know if Google Glass is going to be, I don't think it's going to be good or bad, but it's going to change things, and it's going to be something that's very interesting, and it's going to mean new perspectives and new forms of like embodiment and new narrative forms maybe. When I first came to Sweden, I spent about 4 years travelling and living out of a rucksack in countries often that didn't have electricity. And I landed out of that, I came to Sweden, and I thought, wow, a lot of people talk to themselves in Sweden. Because I didn't know that you could do the hand-free thing with the phone. I didn't even have a mobile. I didn't get one until I was much older. And I was convinced for months that people were talking to themselves everywhere. And because I'd come to a new country, I thought it was a cultural thing. But then I found out, oh, they're all on the phone. Everyone's on the phone. And I think that these new behaviours open themselves up, and then you recognise them, and then they become part of your life. And now it's just normal. Now I'm noticing people on buses and public transport in Stockholm that they don't look out the windows, and it's incredible how many people are on screen in their waking time.
One more question? No? Okay, but then we'll have coffee, so if you want to talk to James, you can just...
Most people call me Jim too, but James is my name. There's my email too if you'd like to continue a conversation online. Thank you very much.